Welcome, everybody. Welcome to Lady Margaret Hall. Welcome to the Reuters Institute. I was trying to remember if I've ever seen this lecture so packed out. I think this breaks all records. It's almost as though there's something interesting to talk about. I can't think what. Mitali and I discussed who we should think about to give this lecture each year, which is always an interesting discussion. And we refreshed our memory, and it was just after the American elections, and we thought the prospect of a President Trump was going to be bound to be interesting, but I don't think any of us could possibly have imagined quite how urgently and searingly topical the issue would in fact be. In 5 or 6 weeks, we've seen what Timothy Snyder calls acts of anticipatory obedience from newspaper publishers, big tech barons, and many others who are keen to stay on side with this new administration. We've seen the Associated Press excluded from the White House reporters' pool. I mean, things that would have been unimaginable even 2 months ago, for daring to exert its own editorial independence. And at the same time, we've seen people admitted to the White House press conferences who barely qualify as journalistic outputs at all. We've seen legal actions, threats, denunciations of journalists, common enough in repressive autocracies. We must remind ourselves that America is not unique in that respect, but unprecedented in a country which once prided itself on the protections of the First Amendment. And in the meeting that we had with the advisory board just before we came here, it was so useful to hear voices from other countries who have been through this. But they all said, even though we have been through this, there is an added punch in the fact that this is happening in America, because it's bound to have an impact on our countries too. So it's with great pleasure that we welcome to Oxford tonight Dean Jelani Cobb from the Columbia Journalism School. Professor Cobb is an immensely distinguished historian, essayist, editor, producer, commentator, educator, and journalistic and academic leader. He joined the faculty at the University of Columbia in 2016 and became dean in 2022. There's a famous, those of us who've been to Columbia will have walked many times past a bronze plaque in the journalism school, which is a quote from Joseph Pulitzer. I'm just going to read it out. Our republic and its press will rise or fall together. An able, disinterested, public-spirited press with trained intelligence to know the right and the courage to do it can preserve that public virtue without which popular government is a sham and a mockery. A cynical, mercenary, demagogic press will produce in time a people as base as itself. The power to mold the future of the republic will be in the hands of the journalists of future generations. Those words have seldom felt more prophetic or vital, and we look forward with immense interest to Dean Cobb's lecture tonight.
Good evening, and thank you for that introduction. I'm more than honored to be here with you this evening. I only wish that there was more to talk about. So, journalism is the work of reporting the news. Often, events transpire at such a pace that it is difficult to find a discrete beginning and end with which to frame one's reporting. We have a well-worn phrase for moments like that. This is a developing story. I began working on this speech while thinking of one set of challenges to the public's trust in news media. But in light of recent events, have been forced to consider a very different set of implications to that idea. I do not yet have all the facts, yet circumstance warrants that I at least touch upon events that have transpired in my country and on my own campus at Columbia University. So to borrow a phrase, this is a developing speech. I will deliver the original version of this talk, and then I will attach an addendum meant to reflect other concerns that warrant attention. My original speech begins with these words. 5 years ago, this week, in the city of New York, where I live, 5 years ago this week, the city of New York, where I live, introduced a series of protocols in response to a pathogen that was then being called the novel coronavirus. Those protocols, which eventually came to be known as lockdown, urged residents to remain at home, if at all possible, to avoid gathering in crowds, to wash their hands frequently, and to designate a single individual who would conduct the grocery shopping, thereby minimizing the number of potential exposures any one household might experience. A New York Times headline from that week screamed, "Italy announces restrictions over entire country in attempt to halt coronavirus." Reports about the virus's impact in other parts of the world, particularly China, where it had originated, and Italy, where it spread with such velocity, ricocheted around the internet. News reports informed us that we should expect this emergency plan to be in effect for 1 to 2 weeks. A local news station ran a story about the first infected person in New York City and the severity of his symptoms. As a picture of the jeopardy we faced began to take shape, my own household, like hundreds of thousands of others in the city, began to make plans. At the time, our household consisted of myself, my wife, our 2-year-old daughter Lennox, and our 5-month-old twin sons, August and Hollis. We divided tasks, recognizing that we would have to manage without childcare. I phoned my 22-year-old nephew, who was then preparing for a spring break trip to Florida, and told him to cancel his plans. I sent him money and urged him to go to his local market and purchase enough groceries to last for a month. I then began what seemed to be the simplest, most logical course of action, but was in fact one of the most complicated, consequential, and political acts of the entire pandemic: identifying news sources that were carrying relevant information about the emerging pandemic. I am far from a neutral observer here. At the time, I was in my 4th year on the faculty of one of the finest journalism schools in the world, and my 5th year as a staff writer at The New Yorker. I was able to contact friends who had decades of experience reporting on healthcare, epidemiology, and public health. It was not difficult for me to get word of what types of coverage different outlets were planning as the crisis unfolded. But I was also aware that even in that early moment, many people saw the emerging crisis in a different light. About a week earlier, I'd attended the convention of the Conservative Political Action Committee, CPAC, in Northern Virginia for a story I was working on. As I stood in line, waiting to enter the convention hall, 2 men behind me discussed the quote-unquote hoax that was being fomented by liberal media. The purported virus, one told the other, did not exist and was simply an invention crafted to tank the economy and thereby diminish the likelihood of Donald Trump being reelected that November. This was the first time I'd heard such sentiments in person, but on the internet they already had the ring of familiarity. Theories ranged from the complete non-existence of what eventually came to be known as the COVID-19 virus, to the idea that it had come about as some form of sophisticated biological warfare created by China and intended to destabilize the West. In Manhattan, our days bled into each other, a ceaseless and isolated stream of diaper changes, feedings, laundry, bathings, and bottle preparation. We followed protocols. When it came to be known that the COVID virus was airborne, we masked. We avoided unnecessary gatherings. And when COVID vaccines became available the following year, ours was among the earlier families to be vaccinated. I later joked that the miracle of that first COVID spring was not that we managed to avoid infection, but rather none of us chewed off a limb to escape that apartment. Yet it was also clear that our actions stemmed directly from the information in which we placed credence. We reliably read reporters like Don McNeil in the New York Times and Ed Young in the Atlantic, Zeynep Tufekci in the Times. One of my earliest conversations was with Laurie Garrett, who had covered pandemics for years before this one emerged. Newer outlets like Stat News provided cutting-edge information about the evolving medical and scientific understanding of the virus, its behaviors, and its potential weaknesses. At the same time, a growing disdain for this consensus was easy to find. Fueled by suspicions and cynicism of an entirely different information ecosystem, one prominently anchored in social media and often, though not exclusively, right-wing news outlets, a differing set of behaviors emerged. A mirror image reversal in which both preventative measures like masks and immunological ones like vaccines were equally disdained. With retrospective clarity, it seems obvious that the events we experienced beginning 5 years ago were not simply a replay of that established literary trope of humankind versus nature, but rather a contest of dueling information systems, two feuding epistemologies and distribution networks that ferried their disparate conclusions to their polarized constituencies. There's no need to walk through the remainder of this story. We recall the gradual way in which the virus's grip was pried from our civic lives, the curious way in which the decibel of the arguments over COVID decreased in proportion with the falling numbers of infections globally. We moved on as individuals and societies. As a planet, our fractures were increasingly faint. But what remains strikingly relevant in this moment, in which a different brand of dissension, acrimony, and bitterness has defined our civic lives internationally and nurtured authoritarian movements across the globe and threatened the viability of democracy, is the simple, profound question beneath the COVID-era conflicts. Who do you trust? Machiavelli posited that those who would wield power must utilize some ratio of force or fraud. Democracy, however, demands of us a third F, faith, the fundamental trust in the rationality of one's fellow citizens, a belief that the institutions upon which society depends are capable and willing to execute the tasks with which they are charged. This is not a naive, credulous faith, which is why democracies require mechanisms to counterbalance and check the power of their various official structures. But nonetheless, the system of self-governance requires a portion of trust that this clamorous, idealistic scheme is actually capable of functioning. It's easy to see that the opposite of democracy is despotism. It is somewhat more difficult to discern an equal truth that the opposite of democracy is cynicism. It's no coincidence, for instance, that conspiracy theories, no matter their provenance, subject matter, or target audience, share one common trait, and that they almost always begin with the most cynical possible assumptions about the situation they purport to explain. It's for this reason that we've devoted such time and energy to trying to understand the declining trust people across national boundaries place in an array of public institutions, most prominently the focus of today's discussion, journalism. No one here needs to be told how complicated and fraught this situation is, but it's worth noting that 5 years after its onset, the COVID pandemic remains the most vital example of the real-world consequences that this lack of trust can inspire. Last year, the Reuters Institute itself noted the severity of this situation, observing that just 40% of respondents across 47 markets say that they trust most news. These observations are in good intellectual company. In the United States, where this issue has been relentlessly surveyed and examined, earlier this year, the Edelman Trust Institute reported a link between political and social grievance and distrust in institutions. Not surprisingly, those who felt the most aggrieved had the least faith in institutions. These grievances were directed at government, business, and particularly at media. At the same time, this declining trust emerged at a moment, at a crisis moment, in which millions of people across the globe rightfully feel that institutions they've trusted have failed to deliver for them. The surge of populist anger that has upset the political orders across the globe did not come from nowhere. Notably, the Edelman report cites a, quote, generation of grievances that predate the global economic crisis of 2008 and factor into later social convulsions like Brexit here and the 2016 presidential election in the United States. In this light, conflict over the handling of the pandemic is just the latest in a long series of social dislocations that have produced widespread distrust. Add into this mix the difficult economic fortunes of a broadening swath of middle-class and formerly middle-class households, and the astounding growth of capital for the wealthiest sliver of Western economies, and the picture begins to come into focus. The autocratic currents that have seized upon this populist anger have, in country after country, including notably the United States, offered simplistic, tribalistic explanations for their hardship. We all know the playbook: the demagogic demonization of ethnic and religious groups, the hallmark attacks upon institutions of accountability like journalism. In a moment of notable candor, during a 2016 conversation with the journalist Leslie Stahl, Donald Trump reportedly stated that his relentless attacks upon the press were designed to achieve a specific objective. "I do it," Stahl later reported, "so that when you write negative stories about me, people will not believe you." It should be noted that journalism confronts some inherent disadvantages in challenging demagoguery. The hallmark of quality journalism is its ability to render the complexities of the world in their proper nuances and details. Demagogues have no such need for subtleties. They paint in broad strokes and primary colors. Our first allegiance is to the truth. Here, demagogues are again liberated. In January 2021, the Washington Post's rolling tracker identified some 30,000 lies or misleading statements uttered by Donald Trump during his first presidency. We just think about that. Any journalist present knows that politicians lie. Yet what distinguishes the garden variety political prevarication from the demagogue level fabrication is the ease and volume with which these untruths pour forth. In any case, the demagogue's rendering of the world is legible, understandable, simple. All problems have clear solutions, and all life's difficulties are easily attributable to specific culprits. We, on the other hand, are tasked with delivering information that challenges the beliefs or worldviews of our audiences. The demagogue exists solely to confirm his audience's most base and volatile presumptions. In this context, there is an inverse ratio between our vulnerability and our credibility. Our problem is not simply that the public does not trust us, is that they do trust other dishonest brokers. We are not just witnessing a crisis of credibility, we are experiencing a crisis of credulity as well. We have, particularly in the United States, often been slow to adapt to this state of affairs, operating, and I'm speaking of American journalists, operating on protocols that no longer apply in new circumstances. During the first Trump administration, the American press was reluctant to refer to the blatant untruths as actual lies, or to refer to outright trafficking and racial stereotypes as racist behavior. Our own credulity led to the press treating an autocratic president in the same manner as they would treat a Democratic one. In my public comments, I took to describing this as the left-handed problem of the American press. And in order to explain that, I usually walk through an exercise. Consider for a moment any sport that you have played. This exercise is particularly relevant to those of you who may have played basketball, softball, baseball, tennis, and especially anyone who has boxed. Now consider the first time you competed against a left-handed opponent. As a young baseball player, I devoted hours to learning how to hit a curveball. After a great deal of effort, I learned how to anticipate a pitch that would move down and away from a right-handed batter. But these rules are useless when facing a left-handed pitcher because the ball moves in exactly the opposite direction. In applying conventional approaches to left-handed opponents, a player will find him or herself precisely 180 degrees away from where they should be. In this analogy, the press is a right-handed player, consistently befuddled by the left-handed administration, in which everything moves in exactly the opposite direction. The early days of the second Trump term have been greeted by a different and more troubling trend in the American press: capitulation. Ahead of last year's election, the owners of the Los Angeles Times and the Washington Post intervened to prevent their editorial boards from endorsing the Democratic nominee Kamala Harris. In both instances, the moves were interpreted as efforts to curry favor with the Republican nominee, Donald Trump. In the case of the Washington Post, the owner, Jeff Bezos, spiked the Harris endorsement. His spiking of the Harris endorsement was understood as an effort to protect his other businesses, particularly Blue Origin, Bezos' space exploration company, which depends upon hundreds of millions of dollars in federal contracts. Given Trump's antagonism toward Bezos during his first term, it was not difficult to imagine that those contracts would have been vulnerable in a second Trump term. Notably, ABC News paid $15 million to settle a lawsuit Donald Trump filed against the network and anchor George Stephanopoulos for misstating the nature of a civil ruling against Trump for sexual abuse in a case brought against him by the writer E. Jean Carroll. More recently, Paramount, the parent company of the network CBS, which hosts the show 60 Minutes, explored settling a weak lawsuit Trump brought for $10 billion for what he alleged was a deceptive editing of an interview with Kamala Harris. These are right-handed responses. As Jamil Jaffer, the director of the Knight First Amendment Center at Columbia University, wrote last month in a New York Times op-ed, each settlement weakens the democratic freedoms upon which these media organizations depend. They create precedents, not legal ones, but precedents nonetheless, that will shape the way judges and the public think about press freedom and its limits. They also damage the media institution's prestige and, here's that word again, credibility. That's the end of the quote. This behavior raises serious questions about the willingness of these outlets to report aggressively on the administration and compound the crisis of trustworthiness. If we aspire to the public trust, we have to begin by delivering what we have so often declared to be the point of all this effort: facts, information, accountability, all of it delivered without fear or favor. At worst, this capitulation suggests news organizations, or at least the individuals who own and operate them, have failed to grasp the full implications of the current moment. This should remind us that even the person who brings a knife to a gunfight is infinitely better equipped than the person who brought a bottle of wine because he thought it was a dinner party. In this regard, the Associated Press warrants particular attention. As my colleague Margaret Sullivan noted in a column this morning, their steadfast refusal to adhere to the president's demand that they refer to the body of water commonly known as the Gulf of Mexico as the Gulf of America is an example of what courage looks like. The petulant consequence for this refusal, which is consistent with the AP's style book, has been the banning of the organization from White House briefings and having their reporters and photographers disallowed from traveling with the president. In response, the AP has filed a suit on First Amendment grounds. Yet even this example of courage highlights the relative dearth of it in other places. It is odd that any news organizations, certainly any American one, would continue to attend White House briefings or travel with the president while a reputable outlet has been exiled for a decision made on editorial principle. History will hold us accountable for our behavior in moments like this one. None of these shortcomings fully explain the crises of credibility and credulity, but they exacerbate the problems. The same Reuters report suggested that several dynamics are at the heart of this phenomenon, including partisanship, age, and education. I would like to include an additional element, proximity. It has been widely noted that the biggest impact of the disruption of journalism's business model has been felt on the local level. Here in the UK, at least 320 local publications shuttered between 2009 and 2019. In the United States, a recent survey discovered that the nation had lost more than a third of its local newspapers, of the local newspapers that existed just 20 years ago. This is significant because people understand their relationships with local institutions differently than they do their connections with much bigger national ones. It has been well established that the death of a newspaper does not simply affect the fortunes of the journalists and editors employed there, but rather also brings about a whole raft of consequences for the community itself, including declining participation in civic life and lower rates of voting. Proximity, however, has another notable effect. It's long been known in the United States, for instance, that citizens hold Congress in low regard. A Gallup poll from 2023 found that just 32% of Americans trusted Congress, as compared with 67% who trusted local government to handle their most pressing problems. This was not shocking. The significant finding is that even those who distrust national government tend to see their own congressional representative in a much more favorable light, even if they did not vote for that person. In 2022, the Knight Foundation study found a 17-point gap in the trust respondents afforded to local news outlets and the level of trust they gave to bigger national ones. This trend was consistent even across lines of partisanship. In the United States, this correlates with broader themes in our history. The population has consistently distrusted large anonymous institutions that exerted a great deal of authority over their lives. In the 19th century, Americans distrusted the railroad trusts. In the early 20th century, they distrusted the newly corporatized banks. Now, the powerful, remote national institution for whom they reserve their disdain is the broader institutional media. In this context, the declining trust in media cannot be understood apart from the declining trust in lots of other institutions. But what is perhaps more telling is what types of institutions, in the American context still, what types of institutions are most consistently trusted? The military, small businesses, and the police. The first two are not hard to understand. The military in the United States, as in many other countries, is associated with the nation's strengths, its virtues, its readiness. Small business is, almost by definition, the most local of the institutions a person will regularly encounter. But the last of them, the police, seemed incongruent, at least to me. At first, I suspected that the polls had undercounted people of color or poor people whose encounters with law enforcement are often more fraught and intimidating. Then I recalled a quirk of the American system of policing. There are nearly 18,000 police departments in the United States, most of whom have fewer than 50 officers, and often fewer than 25. When most Americans think of the police, they think of people whom they may know by face or even by name, someone rooted in their community, someone who has children in their local school system. The crisis of our business model has most heavily damaged precisely the most trusted segment of journalism. I can take this argument a step further and suggest that our crisis of democracy is an amalgamation of many local crises. Given the implications that have been highlighted in the course of this talk, this situation should be highly concerning. Yet I'm increasingly convinced that the forums in which we ponder how we regain the public's trust are asking the wrong question. We will not remedy the cratering local news concern or any of the contributing factors anytime soon. Our quest for the public's trust also highlights a contradiction that should be easily recognizable to us. Journalists are, by disposition and professional protocol, among the least trusting people you will ever meet. I'm reminded of the journalist John Chancellor's favorite adage, if your mother says she loves you, check it out. Rather than hope for the return of a more trusting public, we should work for a more equitably skeptical one. Do not trust us. In fact, do not easily trust anyone. Let doubt proliferate. Not the cynicism I spoke of earlier in this talk, but a well-calibrated skepticism. Journalism will always require some element of public trust. We will, for instance, continue to rely upon anonymous sources into the foreseeable future. But we should strive to minimize the extent to which we ask anyone to take us or anyone else at their word. In this way, we address both the questions of credibility and credulity. It follows that news organizations must adhere to our codes of ethics more scrupulously than ever before. Crucially, when we make mistakes, we should not hesitate to own up to them. As Margaret Sullivan also pointed out in a conversation we had the other day, only organizations that are devoted to getting it right will ever tell you when they got it wrong. In this regard, the definition of an untrustworthy news source is one that has never deemed it necessary to issue a correction. How, you may ask, do we then inspire the public to believe what is being reported? Journalism should steal a page from the social sciences, where every source is documented, and the hard sciences, where every finding must be replicable. In those arenas, showing how you derived your conclusions has long been a professional requirement. Every piece of significant journalism should be accompanied by a hyperlink with a caption that says, "This is how this story was reported," where a reader can find all of the documents, interviews, and research that went into the news that they just consumed. If so inclined, the reader should be able to trace these steps and draw the same conclusions. Not only does this minimize the argument that the news is, as some cynics speculated, simply made up, it would throw down a gauntlet before other types of outlets that we must now compete with for public influence. Our great strength is that we report, we probe, we seek answers. In short, we are prepared to show our work. A healthy, well-informed public is one that demands the competing sources of so-called information do the same. Those were my original comments. I finished them in the midst of a caffeine-fueled all-nighter that reinforced to me that working through the night at 55 is very different than doing so at 25. Around 5 a.m., I gathered my things and headed to John F. Kennedy Airport for my flight here. En route, I learned that federal agents had detained a member of the Columbia community who was one of the primary organizers of last year's encampments protesting the Gaza war. Details remain hazy, but it has been reported that both this person's visa and his green card were revoked under the 1952 Immigration and Security Act, a piece of Cold War legislation that was commonly weaponized against Jewish immigrants during anti-Semitic purges of alleged subversives. A day earlier, the Trump administration had announced its intention to cancel $400 million in federal grants to Columbia University as a consequence for the institution's alleged failure to take the problem of anti-Semitism seriously. 2 weeks prior to that, I hosted a Zoom conversation at Columbia with the historian Ellen Schrecker. Professor Schrecker's scholarship examines the ways in which the McCarthy era in the United States impacted higher education. I recommend her book, No Ivory Tower, to anyone seeking to understand how the current era of government repression may play out in higher education in the United States. During the question and answer session, Professor Schrecker pointed out an odd tendency of universities during the 1950s to not only fold under the pressure of McCarthyism, targeting their faculty and students, but to do so while deploying the language of free speech and academic freedom. These three distinct moments suggest that even if humans with a great deal of power do not possess a sense of irony, history very much does. I'm aware that the subject of this gathering today is to discuss matters of relevance to journalism. The connection I see here is this. Institutions are created in order to codify values. Our universities, our governments, certainly our news organizations, were meant to not only embody particular principles, but to assure that they can be preserved and transmitted across generations. Values are meant to guide us in difficult times. In the easy times, we already know what to do. The paradox, of course, is that the minute you establish something based upon principle, you are confronted by the question of when you will bend for expediency. Professor Schrecker made one additional point that warrants repetition here, that capitulation never resulted in salvation. Indeed, it seemed only to embolden the most zealous antagonists. We thereby confront an old paradox of those who sought to save the house from a fire, but unwittingly left it to perish in the flood. Thank you.
Thank you, Dean Cobb. And I don't box, but it feels like Columbia University, through the course of the last 48 hours, has had a bit of a 1-2 punch. Yeah. And I know it's been hard. So thank you for making the time to have this conversation, hold this space.
Thank you.
We're going to open this up a little bit in terms of the geographic range of it and also the impact of what the last 2 months has been, which is frankly quite stunning, and a sense of what the next few years and months hold for us. May I now invite the rest of our panelists, Steve Ansolabehere, who is a member of the RISG Advisory Board, an expert on elections and part of Harvard University, and Ritu Kapur, who is a journalist from India, a member as well of the Advisory Board. She's been heading up Quint, a news platform, and she's probably had some experience around some of what we heard in the speech today. Let me start with you. This is a developing story, and part of what journalists also do is call it as they see it. I want to start by quoting Adam Jaworski, who said, "Democracies are when parties lose." In the course of the last few months, a lot of people have pointed to events in the US as an autogolpe, a self-coup, an imperialistic presidency, an executive coup. How would you define this period of time that America is living through? And if you were a journalist who was not in America, what would you call it?
I think if I were a journalist not living in America, I would call it the same thing I would call it now, which is that it is the kind of ongoing development of an autocratic impulse that is cloaked within a democratic one. Which is to say, and autocracies and democracies are not opposite in that way. Like autocrats often come to power through democratic elections. They just don't want to be succeeded in a democratic election. And so we have real concerns around that, just in terms of, what we've seen, kind of the violation of norms, there's a real question that gets bandied about in kind of political circles in the United States now, that if the Supreme Court issues a ruling, will the administration follow it? There's no guarantee. That's not a normal kind of concern. That's certainly not a concern that is common in a democracy. And so at the same time, in the United States, there's a particular kind of arrogance attached to being the oldest constitutional democracy in the world. And so you hear that kind of language deployed again and again and again. And what that allows us to do is evade the fact that there has been an anti-democratic history in the United States that is as long as the democratic tradition. And it's the comparison I make is saying, you were talking about a family. You said, look at this family. They have produced in generation after generation such great athletes. This one was a champion in track and field, and this one was, a great swimmer, and you just go through the entire lineage. And then they don't talk about the fact that there's also this really long history of heart disease where people die at 40. And both of those things can be true in your family history. And the United States, we've talked about the athletic side of it. We haven't talked about the length of the anti-democratic tradition that's informing the moment we're in right now.
Steve, you documented this election as it unfolded, and part of what is sort of constantly brought up is that the popular vote went a certain way, and now there is a president in power. How do you read the events of the last 2 months? And as someone who's tracked political trends, are you somewhat shocked and awed, which seems to be the sort of clear motive?
So the election very much was a reflection of economic events over the prior 4 years. And there was nothing surprising about the election from those of us who study it. It was a very uniform shift in the vote of about 3.5% away from the Democrats. It was largely correlated with economic impact. It was most intense among working class poor who were affected severely, adversely by the inflationary run-up a year prior to the election. And that was by far the number one concern. There was not a mandate to do the sorts of things that Donald Trump is attempting to do. So in this sense, it seems incongruous with the election, what he's attempting to do. We've had past presidents do bits of this, not in an accelerated manner, and the question of whether the courts are going to be able to rein him in, are they going to respond, and so forth, is a very live question. But I think ultimately those things will rein him in, as will the increasing reluctance of members of his own party to go along with this, because he only has a 3-seat majority in the U.S. House, and for them to get a tax bill passed, get a budget passed, and so forth, will require incredible discipline. And as inflation goes up because of the tariffs, as the recession comes on, which even he has now agreed is likely to happen, that's what he said on Friday, we're going to see more and more pressure on those Republicans to bolt from their party. And that'll be, so I think his timeline to get things done is very short, which is, I think, why they're very aggressive. What I find, I think there's a deeper, hidden, more difficult story unfolding for those of us who are watching some of the details, and that's the insidious nature of what is being done. So let's take something close to my own experience, which is that many groups scraped all of the federal government websites in the run-up to the inauguration to archive those data to make them permanent. And these were databases concerning climate change and atmospherics and DEI and so forth. Anything that we thought was threatened was being archived. In the aftermath, lawyers want to sue to get those websites put back, have had a hard time figuring out what to request for because they weren't monitoring this stuff in advance. So it's very hard to put it all back together. So they're relying pretty heavily on the academic community now to say, what were the websites, what were the locations, what's the data, and so forth. So there's a bit of like, the toothpaste is out of the tube, how do you put it back? It's very difficult if you don't even know where the tube was or what the tube was. Similarly, a lot of the executive orders are going after very specific groups, like law firms that successfully sued Trump the first time or that defeated him in his quest to win re-election. And those are a little easier because there are parties that are defending themselves and they can target the response. But it is incredibly disruptive to kind of the normal political discourse that we have. My big question about what the Trump administration is doing, given how like literally like just throwing spaghetti against the wall, is whether they're just wasting a lot of their own time. Their time is short, and the more they do of these things, and the more defending they have to do of things like putting some law firm on notice, the more time of their own they waste. So for me, that's the big question over the next 18 months to 2 years, whether or not they're going to end up wasting a lot of their own time in doing things that are just petty, mean-spirited, Nixon-era activities.
Can I add something really quickly?
Please.
The problem with Donald Trump is that he has not conformed to rational political behavior from the beginning. First off, he was never supposed to get through the primaries. He was supposed to be cut down by all of the dynamics that typically keep candidates like him out of the running. Beyond that, there are things that happen in normal political behavior that have not happened with him, which is, for instance, he lost an election, a presidential election. When you lose a presidential election, your party loses your phone number. Think about the level of antipathy the Republican Party expressed toward Mitt Romney. It was like a long ago ex calling you, like, wait, what? Do I remember you? No. But that's not what happened. No. Then moreover, he attempted to overthrow the government, which is what January 6th was, an attempt to prevent the transition from one party, the peaceful transition of power from one party to the other, one president to the next. That has been forgotten in the United States. It's a non-issue. When you bring it up, people are like, why are you talking about old stuff? Like an attempted coup d'etat. His popularity, despite, when we think about the kind of typical, again, rational behavior of politics, his poor handling of the pandemic led to a recession that cratered the economy. And still, Joe Biden barely beat him in 2020. And so, but for the pandemic, he would have won re-election, despite all of the other kind of madness that happened in that time frame. And he then, in an election around economic anxiety, purportedly about economic anxiety, ran on the weak economy that he'd engineered through his poor handling of the pandemic to say that he was better equipped to handle the current malaise of the economy, none of which conforms to a rational kind of decision-making process unless we reflect the fact that he represents something beyond a kind of typical political phenomenon. And that is the xenophobic, nationalistic, racist, certainly ethnocentric ideal that he embodies. And that has warped the calculus for how people respond to him politically, which is why I think we're going back to like left-handed and right-handed. Were we talking about any other kind of phenomenon, I would say that would actually be what we could expect. I don't expect that to happen. And I also fully expect for him in 4 years, barring kind of physical ailment or anything or infirmity, I expect him to contest the constitutional prohibition on presidents serving 3 terms. He has said that he would do this, and everything that he said that he would do, he has done. And so I think we can't expect rational political behavior to resolve a phenomenon that's not entirely rooted in kind of rational bases.
Can I ask a quick question, and then I'll come to Ritu? And hindsight is always 2020. But in the run-up to these elections, did you see in broad media enough coverage about the issue of inflation? I mean, one would think counterintuitively that the front page of every newspaper now should print the price of X. That seems to be the exact number one thing that's on people's minds. And yet here we are in this sort of shoot and scoot philosophy where, as someone was saying earlier, you wake up every morning and you're not sure what it is that you're going to deal with as a new headline item.
Yeah, I think that's the other thing. The other part of it is that we have tended to kind of move away from this is what you said you were running on, this is what you said you were going to do. And someone described it as the press as behaving like a cat when someone has a laser pointer. And so we just followed all these things all over the place, as opposed to staying with the one thing. Even if we were to kind of follow the economic part of it and say, well, this week your eggs cost a full $1 more than they did last week. And that isn't being reported, at least not consistently either.
It's a frazzled cat.
Right.
Ritu, the good news or bad is that there are examples to draw from across the world that have sort of traveled this road a bit further down than America seems to have at this point. And a lot of what is being voiced can actually be run on a much longer term basis. You can be petty for a very long time. Legal harassment doesn't necessarily mean detention, but it does take an inordinate amount of time and effort and just saps you of all your energy, as also financial stress. Where does it leave journalism a few years down the line?
I also want to add that in addition to all of that,
Yes.
is that in India, there are no limited terms for Prime Minister.
In America either, actually.
Our cup is flowing over this evening.
This is flashing me back so much to, I think, when my first year on the advisory board, I was sitting right here with Marty Batten, and Trump, I think, had just won. And Marty was talking about how, it's a very intelligent use of social media that's been done, and it's sort of unprecedented. And I had to say, no, we did it first. Modi did it before, and he did it to 1.4 billion people. So, we are. I think the difference that I see, even though Dr. Jelani referred to it in his talk, is the backing of democratic institutions. I think that I still hold out hope in the US, because in India, if you're a journalist or a journalistic organization that is in some way or the other under attack from the powers that be, the courts are often not a recourse. The process as a punishment is a phrase we're all too familiar with, that that once you have a slew of cases against you, you're just going to be in the courts forever. I feel that I don't think that's where America is at. And I also think the other big difference is large legacy media. There is still an N by T. In India, large legacy, large media, the bigger you are, the more likely you're owned by a large corporate. And because you're owned by a large corporate, the larger the chances that you will be capitulating, crawling, becoming a propaganda vehicle, which further, when it comes to trust and credibility, independent news organizations come under that much more attack because the larger voices with the larger reach are saying something that you are contesting. But they have, so how that works is that our credibility is actually being undermined when we're actually doing solid, fact-based, data-based reporting or ground reporting, going out into the field. So yeah, I mean, the cup brimmeth over, and yet you sort of start finding ways of navigating it because you know that the only way is to constantly put the counter narrative out there. The only thing that I think all of us need to be, as journalists, need to be cautious of is not getting trapped by your own confirmation bias, and I must confess that I think some of us have had to pull ourselves out of those traps where a lot of your journalism sometimes becomes a reaction to the atrocities and the excesses. And that becomes sort of that leads to the news avoidance because it's sort of it further frustrates the readers, the viewers, the users of your content away from you.
Yeah.
And I think what we also tend to miss because you're so caught up sometimes in your own bubble of intellectuals and journalists and what's being said on social media, which is also feeding into your own confirmation bias, is that you really miss the sentiment of the people. Because you might go into the field and look for voices subconsciously which sort of echo your view.
Yeah.
I think that is the big responsibility right now in these times for all of journalism, to not fall into those traps.
I do want to get back to that point about the great capitulation because it's playing out in the US as well. And I think the tricky thing is there are as many rewards for capitulating as there are penalties for not. And we're seeing that play out with a lot of big tech and with news media as well. But I just want to pick up this point on trust and ask you both. It's low worldwide. The bad news is it's even lower in the US. Our research shows it's 32%, which is the bottom half of countries. And increasingly, Dean Cobb, this trust is sort of reflective of a large section of audiences that feels quite disengaged and frankly not reflected in the news. It is more and more young people. It is people from a lower socioeconomic background. It's people at other sort of minority intersections. Is there an understanding of the fact that perhaps the larger task at this point for news and journalism is to go out and talk to that audience rather than be sort of focusing on the same segment that is either not responding or doesn't care?
Well, I mean, I think there's kind of built-in contradictions. One, these are not new contradictions. I think these are contradictions that we are just we finally reached a convergence point where we had to grapple with them.
Yeah.
Even in the old advertising-based model, we were oriented toward people who would buy things, the things that were being advertised.
Yeah.
And so, inherently, you're publishing. If you have a advertising base that is selling cars and vacations and those kinds of things, and you are writing stories that people who have disposable income are going to read because that's, baked into the system there. We always had that problem. We've reached a point now where, we can't navigate around it. The other thing I think, and I have this conversation now with, I'll give you an example of this. About, I guess maybe it was a year and a half ago or 2 years ago, USA Today hired a reporter dedicated to covering Taylor Swift. And everyone lost their minds. They were like, "Oh my God! Like, look at what they're doing!" And I said, even when we had money, we published horoscopes. Even at the point where newspapers were profitable, we still published, relationship advice columns and like these kinds of things. And we tend to take ourselves too seriously. Like we think that our audience wants hard-hitting investigative report after hard-hitting investigative report. And no, they want to know what Taylor Swift wore in her last concert and like who designed it and so on. And then they're like, oh, wait, also there's a city council member who's taking bribes. And so, but
From Taylor Swift.
from Taylor Swift,
For the guests.
like that's a story, that is the dream story. But the fact of it is that, we always were selling a product different than the product we like to tell ourselves we were selling. Yeah. Like we like to think about the most noble, virtuous, democracy-affirming aspects of our work.
Yeah.
And the last thing I'll say is that, in the United States, there was a study, this is maybe a decade ago, maybe even longer ago, people wanted to know what determined people's allegiance to one local news station versus the other.
Yeah.
Do you know what it boiled down to? The weather person and the sports person. Because that's all they really cared about. Everything else, like what Parliament does or what Congress does, or everybody else is gonna have the same news. It's like, I like the weather person, he's funny, or the sports person is really, great. And so we need to think about that in terms of how we re-engage those audiences. News avoidance is a natural byproduct of the fact that we're not giving people the news that they really want and pretty much consistently always wanted.
Yeah. There's a political example of that, and I wanted to talk to you about it. The Muslim community in the Bronx, which is easily sort of the poorest and the bluest congressional district, voted overwhelmingly for Trump, as did the Hispanics and Latinos. What is journalism not getting about what's happening with very large segments that feel quite disenfranchised with the journalistic process? And I might add, this is not about the US only. I'm not sort of doing a US bashing conversation. This is happening across countries.
Yeah.
Well, now that you say that.
Well, I think one thing that's misunderstood is who the working class in the United States is. Mm-hmm. It is not white working class. Working class in the United States is brown.
That's right.
It's Asians, it's Muslims from the Middle East, from North Africa, it's blacks, it's Hispanics. And whites now are about 57% of the population. So this is a big population. And those people were really affected by inflation. These people are working 3 or 4 jobs, right? We don't even capture them in government statistics about employment properly, right? Because the government employment statistics are based in a world where everybody had one full-time job. These people are driving Ubers, delivering food, and so forth, and they're stitching it together. And for them, the next meal is more important than the immigration threat.
Yeah.
Right. So the 2020 election looks identical to the 2024 election among whites. White working class men voted for Trump at the same rate that they voted for Trump in 2020, and so forth. It was Hispanics and Asians who shifted, especially lower income Hispanics and Asians, who shifted toward the Republicans. And it's a bit of a tragedy, but that is who swung the election this time.
Part of the answer is also meeting audiences where they are. And it's certainly not on news websites. It was for a long period of time on social media, and now increasingly, especially in the US, it's individuals and individual news creators and podcasts. is Joe Rogan now mainstream, or is mainstream still mainstream?
Yeah, I mean, I think that, first off, we have a lot to learn because there are people who are adept at building audience, Now, granted, some of the things they do, we are ethically prohibited from doing,
Yes.
which is, again, going back to the disadvantage. But some of it is savvy marketing. Some of it is kind of engaging with people. One of the things that people pointed out about Joe Rogan is that irrespective of like the very many criticisms people could make about him, he does have people on the air for 2 hours or 3 hours. Is not the old snippet, here's 2 minutes of this person and we've edited out anything that they say that's controversial. It shows that you can hold people's attention for a long period of time. And so what influencers are doing, not necessarily the same thing, but I inspired a round of gasps the other day when I had said that I wanted to create some sort of program at the journalism school where we bring in a bunch of influencers and we talk to them about journalism and ethics, and they talk to us about audience development and all these other kind of things. And
The other side, as we call Cambridge.
right, exactly.
But this is really important because the audiences in the United States for news have been shrinking by all measures. But people are getting their information, their news from social media. In other words, you can't even trace what source it came from. You don't know if this was a New York Times article or something somebody just made up. It's coming from your friends. It's just whatever they're recirculating. And we don't talk about the news and the media that way, but that's becoming the dominant form of conveyance of information, of news information.
Yeah, and there's plenty of examples.
A not very popular conversations that I've had in my newsroom is actually to do that, which is to say, let's try and understand why and how an influencer or a content creator is being able to capture the mind of the audiences in a way that we're not, and what are some of the tricks that we need to borrow from them, which means that as a journalist, no longer is it enough for you to have done that really good, solid story. You've got to be. It's no longer a situation where you as a journalist do the story and somebody else is, responsible for the marketing or the distribution of it, because you are the marketing. You need to build yourself, because people are responding not to a journalistic brand, but they're responding to someone who is like somebody they know or they want to listen to, somebody who is in their social network, which is why we are consciously working at really building not so much the brand, say the Quint as the brand, but as each of those journalists are. I think the most wonderful thing that happened during the last elections, which still made a dent in the outcome of the elections.
The elections in India, you mean?
In the elections in India, sorry. Which is that a lot of the influencers, they actually picked up solid journalism done by journalists, and they amplified it. There's no way that we would have been able to reach the kind of audiences that they reached. So it was great for them because they got sort of ready-made content, and it was great for us because we could reach audiences. So I don't think it's as simple as getting influencers and creators. I see a lot of conversation on that. Get them into the newsroom or do marketing deals with them. I don't think it's that. I think it's understanding what is it that is making people respond to their content. Some of it is obvious. They're sort of over the top. They're sensational. They've got conspiracy theories. There's all of that. So not that. The ones that are making a difference. And I think it's really important. I'm not very popular in my newsroom when I keep bringing this up, but I think it is survival.
You're a news editor. Who said you had to be popular? I've done some very terrible timekeeping, and I want to open up the space for questions from the audience. The best way to do it is to raise your hand. We'll try and get a mic to you. I see Maria at the back, and then the gentleman in front. Maria.
I'm from Spain, and I'm also a Columbia J School alumna. My question for Dean Cobb and perhaps also to you, Steve, for Harvard. Is the First Amendment in peril in the US? And should universities as Columbia, Harvard, and others somehow get together and do something to support it? Thank you.
What can you say? Is the First Amendment what?
In peril, at risk
Oh, in
in
peril,
the US?
yeah. So the interesting thing about this is that the Knight First Amendment Institute, which is housed at Columbia, released a statement about the arrest of this member of the community. For legal reasons, I'm not allowed to repeat his name. And so the arrest of this person, it appears that the protests of last spring were fundamental to the case that the United States is making about revoking the visa and revoking the green card. And if so, that is a clear First Amendment provocation. It has not been interpreted as such. As a matter of fact, only on rare occasions, there's a kind of parallel track about DEI and the government demanding that people remove DEI from their universities or their courses and so on. And then there's this really unsettled area of the law about whether or not it amounts to censorship for the federal government to say we will withdraw money if you engage in particular kinds of speech. And so while that may seem obvious, there's not a body of law in the United States that actually says this is the case. And so there are parts of First Amendment law that have not been settled that are at the heart of what we're seeing transpire right now. And then the other part of this is another dynamic. I mentioned the Cold War and McCarthy era element of this, but there's another part of it which, goes back to 9/11 in the United States and the raft of terrorism laws that came out, where there's basically an exemption in the First Amendment for anything that's deemed to have given material support to terrorism. What does that mean? Your guess is as good as mine. And we knew that at the time. It's not one of those things that just happened. At the time, there was this public hysteria about national security. But even in that moment, there were voices saying, look, we are creating laws, or we're writing laws in such an ambiguous way that they will come back to bite us. We don't know what this is going to do to civil liberties. And now we have another instance where we're having to grapple with that question.
But the U.S. Supreme Court has become more and more and more pro-First Amendment over the past 25 years. I don't think the fundamental law around this, these are more marginal cases or marginal, kind of interesting, odd questions. The fundamental law around the First Amendment. And if there's one thing there's a strong majority coalition for, it's the First Amendment. That's the right and the left together. Other things, not so clear for the court.
Gentleman in the front.
Dean Cobb, hi. Thanks very much for the lecture. I'm James Lamont from the Financial Times. I want to take you back to your remarks about capitulation and specifically Blue Origin and the Washington Post. Many news organizations and governments and probably educational establishments run on Amazon Web Services. How much should we be worried about weaponization of the cloud?
I don't know. I'll just say I don't know. I think, on the one hand, there's the argument that Bezos' commercial interests are at the kind of foreground, and that would be a very bad business move, for them. On the other hand, there seems to be a kind of cost-benefit ratio being made there. I don't know what the numbers are, for Blue Origin or what people are thinking about. And then finally, it becomes even more complicated because you mentioned Marty Baron, and he talked about the fact that Bezos was pretty stalwart during the first Trump term. And so which version of him is going to show up? I don't know. I don't know the answer to that.
I'm going to attempt clubbing a couple of questions because there's so many hands. So maybe here and then at the back and then there.
Yeah, Timothy Garton-Ash. I'd like to bring you back to your remedy in the more formal part of your talk. competing epistemologies. The epistemology of Vladimir Putin and Donald Trump, not the truth is different, there is no truth. That is their epistemology. Maybe Zelensky is a dictator. Maybe he isn't. Maybe Ukraine started the war. Did I say that? Maybe I did. Maybe I didn't.
Impossible to know.
Impossible to know. The essential epistemology of democracy, all the way back to ancient Athens, says there is one thing we agree on. There is a truth and there are facts, although we disagree about what they are. Now, your remedy, a more skeptical public, sources, replicative experiments, is beautiful, but it assumes an acceptance of the latter epistemology. But in this discussion, as you've been pointing out, a lot of people don't want that. They want emotion. They want horoscopes. They want to love some pop star. They want to hate other people. They want passion. They want, pride. They want everything the populists offer. So how do you address that problem?
Well, I mean, I read all that stuff too.
Shall we take a couple of questions, and then Nico, and then the lady up there?
Thank you. Hi. I'm wondering if you think that the tone with which we engage with those that maybe disagree with the press or find the press untrustworthy also adds to the credulity issue and credibility issue. And how do we change the tone? What's sort of the new tone that we have to adopt to sort of make a better case, make ourselves more trustworthy? Thank you.
And then a final one there.
I really don't envy you trying to put three questions together, because mine's a bit different as well. But Rachel Corp from ITN, we make the news for the commercial broadcasters. Bringing together a few strands from the talk, you talked about the extent of the Trump lies from the first administration. You also talked about how to have trust with our audiences and readers. We have to perhaps show our workings out and how we got somewhere. I think the British media has been fantastic over the last 2 months across the board in countering some of those untruths and lies that are coming out, and quite dispassionately calling out where they are, whether it's half a sentence in Mail Online or whether it's 15 seconds in a live on Channel 4. And we'll continue to do that. But how much of a danger do you think there is that we end up spending all our time doing this and it drowns out everything else we're doing? Because I think there was a danger of that happening during his first presidency.
What is the truth? How do we tell it? And how much time do we spend telling it?
Well done. Well done.
So to my earlier point, I read all the trash news too. I think the idea is that we were luring people in with the kinds of human interest things, the things that kind of grab people's attention, but that wasn't the only thing that people stayed for, the only thing that people consumed. We had kind of a mix of all these kind of things. Around the epistemological question, that we have to have faith if we're going to actually still participate in democracy, and the idea that at least some majority of those people are going to actually want to engage with the factual basis of the world. If not, the entire thing is lost. And so I think that is the threat that demagogues tend to represent across time. But the thing that we see with Trump is not new in that regard. On the issue of how we talk, I think we do tend to sometimes talk past people or even talk down. I've seen a bunch of instances in a class that I teach. We kind of walk through all the assumptions that you can find in various news stories. Very often, one that Americans are particularly ill-equipped to note is class, social class. A lot of presumptions. In the United States, we don't talk about class. We talk about race. We avoid talking about race, which is our way of avoiding to talk about class. But the kind of implications of social class that show up in our work, I think, are alienating. At the same time, the defense that I would offer is that if someone tells you to take a horse tranquilizer to cure COVID, and you are entitled to roll your eyes about that suspicion, about that level of credulity. There are some things that we should be able to anticipate that people will say, okay, that doesn't seem to make sense. This doesn't seem to make good sense. And on the other side of it, I agree that we have to balance these things. We should do this in some portion. I think that most of our attention should go toward news that we generate, that we gather, that stories that we have tracked down, and some smaller proportion, 15% of it, should be kind of knocking down things people have said that are not true. I think, what I was talking about was also making it such that people don't have to trust us. That one of the things that, a colleague of mine, Rainey Aronson, who runs Frontline in the United States, they do documentaries, and then people will always say, I was taken out of context, So they have started putting the entire interview that the person did on their website. So there'll be a documentary, and then there'll be 10 or 12 interviews that may be an hour long each. And what she found that was shocking was that people would often watch the entire interview, of someone. So you couldn't say that they were taken out of context, and now the audience is even more informed than you might have hoped if you were just giving them a 100-minute documentary to examine. And I think the internet allows us to say, don't trust us, watch this for yourself. Here's the documents. Here are all the things that you can kind of track down. We're not trying to sell you on anything. If you read these things, you'll understand. If you don't draw the same conclusion, you'll understand how we drew the conclusion that we drew.
We are very close to time, but I have a final question for the three of you. Part of a thriving democracy is having a replenishable and strong pool of journalists and scholars and academics and thinkers and lawyers. You're working with a lot of these young people who are hearing all of this gloom and doom. They're also hearing words like DEI are now sort of a bad word. How do you walk into that space and tell someone who's listening online or in this room and wants to consider any of these professions to stay the course?
First, I will say I'm professionally obligated, it's in my contract to say, everyone should apply to Columbia University.
Your poor admissions officer.
I know, exactly. And then after that, that's not hard. This is an honorable profession. The work that we do is valuable. And people depend on us. Even people, who distrust us, they still depend on us in ways that they may not have even grappled with yet. But I really don't have to make that case. When I walk into the building each day, I see a whole array of really talented, eager, smart, thoughtful young journalists. And so it's more the opposite. I derive inspiration from them. And every once in a while, I will dole out some inspiration for them in response. But I don't really worry about the future of the profession when I'm interacting with, the people in that building.
Ritu and then Steve.
As he was speaking, I was just thinking it's quite incredible the kind of work that some of the journalists in India, the kind of work that they're being able to do, the kind of work that young journalists are doing. And very often they don't get any recognition for it. And as an award for doing the crazy amount of work and at risk of their own life or, of being thrown into jail, their award is that they will get very poorly paid because that's what the situation is like. I think there has to be a way of upholding that. I think we're not doing enough of that. Maybe it's because it's one thing to be in a J school and it's another thing to be out in a newsroom, or even more tough is to be a freelance journalist.
Yes.
I think those who are staying the course, despite the, we're also fact checkers, for instance. There was a while after Zuckerberg's great speech where the smarting was not the fact that Meta will maybe not support fact checking anymore. The smarting really was about him equating fact checking with censorship. And I think it was quite incredible and the way the fact-checking community sort of rallied together and said that, we're going to continue the work and, we're going to find ways of... So I think journalist organizations not competing with each other, but working together, being collaborative and being each other's support, I think that I've seen be a great source of confidence in what people are doing, for them to continue doing them.
Steve, final word with you.
I would say that the academy has changed so much from a place that was entirely inwardly focused or heavily inwardly focused into one where people are now thinking, I have these skills, what can I do outside? Even in political science, we find ourselves, because we train people so well in data analysis, competing with Google and Facebook to keep people in the academy. But there's this increasing focus and interest in, I have these skills, what can I do to help the world? What can I do to help journalism or public policy making or decision making in company, wherever. So actually, I think my world, at least in the place I sit, is quite healthy. And I would call out one other group who's here tonight, who are the Reuters Fellows. You guys are heroes. You're doing amazing work in all of your countries. And you're really inspiration to me and others.
We very much like to believe that. They've got capes, all of them. I've been very bad at timekeeping, but I can offer you a drink in the adjoining room where you can speak to all our guests. A big round of applause for our panel this evening.